just want to thank everyone for coming out today. For Emile's talk, as most of you are aware, there's been really two transformative events that have occurred in the last year, one being the Arab Spring and the other being the financial meltdown, or whatever you prefer to call it, in Europe and throughout the world. So today we'll talk a little Emile will talk about the Arab Spring, and after he concludes, I'll discuss an upcoming event that we'll have that will address some of the financial issues at hand. Today, we're fortunate to have Emile Hokayem join us. He's been with the Institute for about a year, I believe, and before coming to the IISS, he was the political editor and foreign affairs columnist for the Abu Dhabi-based English language journal, The National, or the newspaper, The National, I'm sorry. And before that, from 2004 to 2008, he was in Washington, D.C. at the Stimson Center, conducting research on Southwest Asia and Gulf issues. Emile has been all over the world, witnessing events, talking to people, lecturing, being consulted by members of the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the State Department, as well as other governments. So we're fortunate to have him with us here today. As some of you may know, Emile has recently returned from several trips, or one long trip, where he was visiting Tunisia, Egypt, and then Lebanon and Turkey to gauge some of the developments that are ongoing in Syria. Throughout his journey, he has been updating his findings on the popular IISS Voices blog called The Revolutionary Road, Dispatches from a Changing Middle East. This can be accessed at the IISS.org website. I encourage those of you who are interested in events in the Middle East to consult the site, because it's actually quite interesting, and I find it to be very informative. So with that, I will hand over the microphone to Emile, and he'll talk, about 20, 25 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for questions, because I'm sure there'll be many of those. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure being back in Bahrain after over a month on the road. Visited Tunisia, was supposed to make it to Libya, but there was a visa snafu. Egypt and Syria. I have a lot to say about each of these countries, but we have an hour and a half, so you'll have to excuse me for not offering as comprehensive an overview as each of these situations merits. What I'm going to do is spend 10 minutes on each of these countries that I've covered, and I'm going to go from the first one to have experienced a revolution to the last one, or you could put it differently, from the one that is in the best shape to the one that is in the worst shape. Tunisia, then Egypt, then Syria. Let me start with Tunisia. I think Tunisia is significant not because it has any real strategic interest, but it is extremely important because Tunisia has all the ingredients to succeed. If Tunisia fails its transition, then I would argue that most other countries, if not all other countries in the region, in the Arab world, in a way are doomed to fail. This is a homogeneous country with a strong sense of national identity, with a sophisticated population, with a level of regional and global integration that is probably unrivaled in the region. So Tunisia needs to be a success story. I'm glad to report that it is on its way to actually success, or at least relative success when compared to elsewhere in the region. If you look at the transition process in Tunisia, well, I would argue that it was an orderly and successful one. The elections were held. They were postponed. They were supposed to happen in July. They happened in October. But they took place. I was there on the day of the elections. It was fair, it was transparent. Tunisians were excited about the opportunity. The parties campaigned well, and they campaigned in a relatively courteous and decent manner. As some of you may know, I'm Lebanese, so I'm used to boisterous electoral campaigns and people insulting each other and crisis and fist fights on the roads. None of that happened in Tunisia. In a way, it was disappointing. You want to see some action, but it shows you how mature the Tunisian population is as a whole. What helped is that Tunisia had adopted a pretty simple and linear transitional process. So first elections based on a simple electoral law, proportional representation, district-based proportional representation. So everyone knew who and how they were voting and to what end. There was a good information campaign by an independent electoral commission. It was not the interior ministry that organized the elections. It was an independent electoral commission that did it. So the new assembly is a constituent assembly that will write the new constitution. Also, people understood that there would be a new executive authority with a new president, prime minister, a new speaker of parliament. There would be a new constitution within a year that wouldn't be approved by referendum, just the assembly will vote on it. And there will be then new elections for a real, fully empowered executive. So let me try to explain a bit the election results. The turnout was around 60%. So that suggests that some work is needed to raise awareness among the greater Tunisian population. At the same time, it's a pretty respectable turnout figure. If you look at the results then, Al-Nahda, the Tunisian affiliate of the Muslim Brotherhood, came first, and by far. They won 89 seats out of 217. And their success, which was, and that represents around 41.5% of the votes. And their success was predictable, although I have to say we all expected them to get to 30-35%, so them getting to the 40% bar was a surprise, but not a really shocking one. And why did Al-Nahda did so well? Well, first, I've rarely seen a party as organized as Al-Nahda. They were present everywhere. They did extremely good outreach. They talked to everyone around. They were present in a lot of the rural areas that the more traditional parties didn't go to. If you look at the district-based organization, each Nahda supporter had specific responsibilities and actually would fulfill those responsibilities in terms of how many people to talk to, what message to bring, identify who the businessmen are to talk to them about the economic program and who the doctors are to talk to them about the health program. There were real sophistication at this level. I mean, interestingly enough, Al-Nahda also relied on Western electoral consultants that I met there. So it shows you that they were willing to embrace some of the new electoral tactics. Also because Nahda did well, also because of name recognition. Everyone I talked to knew Nahda. They may have been against Nahda, but they knew Nahda. And that mattered a lot because we saw there were over 100 parties that ran in those elections. So it mattered when everybody knew your name. There's also the fact that Al-Nahda could claim a history of suffering and determined opposition to the Ben Ali regime. I mean, no one can say that Al-Nahda really compromised with the Ben Ali regime. Yes, there were times where there were discussions, talks between the two, but they never amounted to an agreement or an arrangement between the two sides. And the Ben Ali regime is so hated that Al-Nahda could use that legacy, that past. But also there's another dimension here, which is identity politics. Tunisians are a bit tired of their identity as Francophone secularists in the Arab world. They want to embrace their Arab Islamic identity more. And Al-Nahda did a pretty good job at this, as telling them that instead of being seen as like a third-tier European country, we can be seen as a top-tier Arab country, a country that leads the change in the region, but that basically means fully embracing what we are, what we historically have been. And Al-Nahda did extremely well in this. The other two parties that did well are actually secularist parties. The CPR, the Congress for the Republic, and a Takatul, a left-wing movement that ran an incredible campaign. Each of them, together they won around 50 seats. And these two parties have real credibility on the street because they too were headed by strong opponents to the Ben Ali regime, Monsef Marzouki, who has been is going to become the Tunisian president soon, is a widely admired person and actually a staunch secularist as well. And those two parties have joined in an alliance with Al-Nahda. The parties that didn't do well are those who adopted an anti-Nahda first approach. And these are mainly two parties, the PDP, a democratic progressive party, and the PDM, which is a smaller liberal party. And basically, they ran a campaign based, I would say, on scare tactics, just warning Tunisians that every progress, every achievement in terms of women's rights, in terms of secular identity, in terms of governance and so on, was going to be reversed if Nahda were to win the elections. This didn't work at all. They won together, I think, 30 seats. They were expected to do a lot better, according to election polls, our own surveys, and so on. But it was clear that Tunisians didn't fall for it. And why is that? Because the Tunisian electorate, whether it is for or against Nahda, recognize that this is a party that has normalized. This is not a party that sits outside the norms of normal, moderate politics anymore. And they punish those parties for using scare tactics. This is also the case because they are seen as elitist and regressive. And to some extent, it's a fair characterization. The PDP in particular is backed by big businessmen who were really worried about Al-Nahda's success. But we're not really in touch with the population. And some of these businessmen shifted their loyalties from the Ben Ali regime to the PDP after Ben Ali left the country. Another interesting element here, dimension, is that populism still works. And I say this because the results of another party, Al-Arida Shabiya, were a surprise to all of us. They won around 26, 28 seats, I think. Al-Arida Shabiya did extremely well in the south, where actually no one campaigned as well as they should have. This is a gentleman, the head of this party is based in London. He owns a TV station. He used to be with Al-Nahda, then made deals with Ben Ali, and his politics are really shifting with the wing. I mean, he's probably the Walid Jumblat of Tunisia, but he did well. He did pretty well for himself, except that his platform was basically promising everything to everyone: free transportation, free health care, free education. Monthly subsidies for everything. I mean, I would move to southern Tunisia if I thought that this was, because it's incredible, but people fell for it. And he's actually a pretty important political player now. So populism works. And the reason why this is important is, let's remember that the grievances that led to this series of Arab uprisings are as much rooted in economic discontent as they are in political discontent. And here there's a problem for Al-Nahda, because Al-Nahda has a liberal economic policy. Al-Nahda does extremely well when they talk to IMF economists and others. Yes, it's a big, but they actually, the son of Rashid Ghannouchi, who is the head of Al-Nahda, is their chief economist. He's the one who wrote their economic platform. He's a liberal, I mean, in terms of economic policy, he's a liberal. And this is not going to sit well with people who actually want a greater role for the state in the Tunisian economy, greater subsidies, greater public sector employment, and so on. So far, Tunisia, as I said, is a success because we see coalition politics, the fact that Al-Nahda, the PDP, Al-Nahda, the CPR, and Atakatul agreed on forming a coalition government. And Monsef Marzouki is going to be the president, Hamadi Jebali is going to be the prime minister, and he's the secretary general of Al-Nahda. And Mustafa Ben Jafar, the head of Atakatul, is going to be the speaker of the Constituent Assembly. And they found an agreement on what is the key issue, which is the role of religion in the new constitution. The CPR and Atakatul accept that Islam should be the religion of the state. But Ghannouchi and Al-Nahda accept the Western notion of citizenship as the basis for rights, so that all citizens are equal regardless of whether they're Muslims or not. So they found the formulation that will be embedded in the new constitution. Now the next steps. Well, today, while we're all watching what's happening in Tahrir Square in Egypt, it's the first meeting of the new Tunisian Constituent Assembly. A great day. I mean, look at the two extremes. Actually, if you were watching Al Jazeera earlier, they had the two images running at the same time. But what's going to be important in the next phase is whether fears about the Islamists are going to be proven or not. There's several small incidents that worry secularists. There was an attack on a TV station before the elections because it showed a Iranian, actually, a documentary, not a documentary, a small show by an Iranian woman against the Islamic Republic in Iran that was seen as an attack on Islam. And Islamists attacked the headquarters of that TV, and there is a court case and so on. Jebali, the new prime minister, made 2 weeks ago comments in front of a Hamas delegation that came to welcome, to congratulate him about, how Tunisia's, Al-Nahda's victory was a first step towards the sixth caliphate, and that also got a lot of Tunisians concerned. Then there is a comment by a very prominent female member of parliament from Al-Nahda about how unmarried mothers in Tunisia were outside society and were just a curse, and very, very nasty language against unmarried mothers. But Al-Nahda has publicly committed to free speech and women's rights, and we will judge them by this. Ghannouchi has been pretty moderate in his own pronouncements. It's also worth keeping in mind that over 60% or around 60% of Tunisian voters did not vote for the Islamists. So we're not talking about a Egypt scenario where we expect actually more than half of the voters voting for the Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood. The challenge for Al-Nahda is whether the moderation of the current leadership is shared by the mid-level cadre. And on this issue, I have to be a bit cautionary. I mean, I met a lot of Al-Nahda mid-level cadre who didn't agree with the conciliatory approach of Ghannouchi. Their argument basically is that we suffered more than the others. We want a great victory. Now is our time. We should be pushing a more conservative agenda. There's another issue here, which is that Al-Nahda is an umbrella organization. It is not a well-solidified, well-controlled organization. Yes, Ghannouchi is the godfather-like figure, and he does command enormous sway. But once they enter government and so on, we'll see different strains appear and divergences and so on. And so it's not impossible for Al-Nahda to splinter further down the road. And that could actually give the rise to more radical Islamists and even more moderate Islamists, as we see in Egypt. Finally, Ennahda is going to be judged based from now on its performance and its ability to compromise. It can no longer run uniquely on identity politics or on a history of suffering under the Ben Ali regime. This is the real test for Al-Nahda, and this is why it's very important for Islamist parties to participate and be engaged in elections. Let me move to Egypt now. Well, I'm very glad I didn't write my short presentation on Egypt until this afternoon, because things there keep changing, and I think today and tomorrow are going to be momentous days. Well, no one can say that Egypt's transitional process is going as smoothly as Tunisia's. This is a very convoluted process that has suffered a number of setbacks and doesn't have the full adherence of all the Egyptian political parties. And I say this because while I describe the Tunisian process as smooth and linear, look at Egypt's transitional process. In March, we had a referendum that was supposed to set the stage for a transition. And that referendum made a couple of constitutional changes to that end. And then a couple days later, the military, which had shepherded this referendum, discarded it and issued its own declaration about how things should proceed. So from the beginning, there was a problem with how the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, was managing the transition. Then it took them several months, it took the SCAF several months to schedule elections, the ones that are supposed to take place on November 28th. They did so under a lot of criticism, because they should have announced the timetable much earlier. They also approved an electoral law that most people wouldn't understand. In the case of Tunisia, as I said, it was a district-based proportional representation. In the case of Egypt, it's a hybrid electoral law. It's part proportional representation, part district-based voting for one candidate. But the districts overlap, and then they kept a million intricacies of the old election law that was supposed to actually help the regime pick the winners and losers at each election. There is nothing in this election law that actually excites people in the positive way, because there is just so much confusion. Then this new assembly was supposed to draft a new constitution, except that the military suggested that it would appoint most of the people drafting that constitution, that this new assembly wouldn't have full constituent, the full powers to write the constitution, which begs the question, why is that assembly for? If they cannot pick the new government and they cannot write the new constitution, if it doesn't have legislative powers, what is it for? Then there is the issue of the question of the presidential elections. We're still waiting for the SCAF to announce a date for the elections. They said March, April, but this is not a commitment. Then they said they wouldn't relinquish power until 2013, which is a full 2 years after the revolution that brought down Mubarak. I'm not going to go through the past 9 months in Egypt. It would take too much time. But let me say that from my talks in Cairo, my 10 days, 2 weeks in Cairo, it's clear that there is a breakdown of order, rising communal violence. The police has not gone back to the streets because they're just so afraid of the population, and they're hated for their record under the previous regime. There were the awful incidents at Maspero, during which the military actually killed over 25 cops who were demonstrating against attacks on churches and so on. It's been violent, it's been bloody, and you do feel the tensions on the street. All this begs a question about the SCAF, the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, which is the de facto ruling body in Egypt. Is it evil or incompetent? And that's the big question among analysts. I'm sorry to put it in it's certainly a mix of all that, and then also a sense of insecurity and the SCAF not being equipped politically and culturally equipped to manage such a transition. But you know, we shouldn't give them a pass for their management in the past 9 months. They've been ruling by decree. So in a way, we're talking about military rule. It's not the government that has the ultimate say in Egypt. 12,000 civilians have been sent to military courts, which is worse than during the Mubarak days. The goal of the SCAF here is to basically extricate itself from politics and governance while preserving its position, its privileges, its business interests, and prevents civilian oversight over its own functioning, its budgets, and so on. And the SCAF has been manipulating Egyptian politics recently to meet that goal. And the discussion within the SCAF are about what the new political system should look like in Egypt. Should they favor a strong or a weak president, a strong or a weak assembly? I mean, which combination of assembly and presidency and new constitution would best preserve the interests of the military? And we've seen a lot of scheming along those lines. So it's not a surprise that most Egyptians I talk to see the SCAF as being essentially a counter-revolutionary force that is not there to protect or foster the achievements of the February revolution, but actually to constrain it. I mean, it is my sense that the phase 2 of the revolution that we're seeing unfold right now has been brewing for several months. The activists I've been talking to are extremely frustrated. They feel completely sidelined from the transitional process. And when they voiced criticism of the regime, of the SCAF, they've been jailed. The most prominent one is the blogger Ala Abdel Fattah, who's been in prison now for 3 weeks. I observed, I was there at the first demonstration in Tahrir Square after he was arrested. So I walked with the demonstrators to the headquarters of the military police and to the military prison where he was, and it was really tense. I mean, at one moment, I was with a couple of other journalists. At one moment, we really thought that we were going to be shot at and tear gassed and so on, and that's 2-3 weeks ago. This is why the events of the past 2-3 days haven't surprised me, because I was expecting that back then. There is also a fear that the military has allowed the Falouls, the remnants of the former ruling party, to come back in the game. If you go look at Upper Egypt, the number of independents who are actually running in districts and independents with former NDP affiliation, they're really numerous. There was a lot of anger at the extended transition. That's what I talked about earlier. It was supposed to last 6 months, and now we're talking about 2 years. And the fact that there is no fixed date for the presidential election. So what I basically heard from the activists, and the activists there, I've met anarchists, I've met leftists, I've met liberals, I met young Muslim brothers, I met a few Salafis and so on. I mean, it's not one national, I'm not talking about one particular group. What they basically told me is either the army goes back to the barracks or we go back to Tahrir. And that's basically what's happening. Now, this latest crisis is mostly the responsibility of the SCAF, of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. 2 weeks ago, they introduced a series of supra-constitutional principles before even the adoption of a constitution, of course, that would allow the army to escape any civilian oversight over its budget, its internal functioning, human resources, so promotions of officers, appointments of military governors and heads of divisions. And I mean, which democratizing country would allow a military to be so self-governing? It's pretty shocking the extent to which they went. The supra-constitutional principles also included and I referred to this earlier, a provision that would have allowed the military to name 80 out of the 100 drafters of the Constitution. The 20 remaining drafters would have come from the new Constituent Assembly. I mean, this is 80 out of 100 drafters would have been appointed by the military. This is an extreme move. I mean, this would have removed all legitimacy to the new parliament. And then there was a clause in it that also said that the army was the protector of the Constitution. And the way the language was drafted put the army almost above the Constitution. It's not that the Constitution was going to protect the army from, undue interference by others. No. The army would have been above the Constitution, and that was also troubling. I was in Cairo that day, and suddenly all the politicians I had planned meetings with and all the activists had, told me, we can't meet, we have to go to the headquarters, we have to plan for the next stage. This is completely unacceptable. And this basically ranged from liberals to Muslim brothers. Everyone was opposed to that. Obviously, we're all reading the news, so we know what happened in the past 2 days. 35 killed, if not more, in the past few days. Yesterday, the resignation of the government. First, we were told that it was accepted by the SCAF, and then later that it was rejected by the SCAF. There is a lot of confusion happening here. We feel that the army has no idea about how to approach this new phase. The difference between January and February and now is that back in January, February, no one was saying the army was killing the protesters. Now people are saying that it's the army that has blood on its hands. And it's qualitatively, it's a huge change because back in January, February, the army was seen in a way as protecting the demonstrators. And that was one of the reasons why the transition happened in a relatively smooth way, whereas now it's really the army versus the demonstrators. And I think that that doesn't bode well. There is a real possibility for an escalation and greater violence in the coming few days. I expect the demonstrations to attract a lot more people. Now, what does this mean in terms of transition? Well, Egyptians were supposed to go to the polls on November 28th, which is just 6 days from now. There are two levels here. The practical level is that can the government, can the military organize elections in a safe way, given what's happening on the streets? And there is a lot of doubt about this. And it would be a horrible thing if we were to witness clashes outside polling stations, call for boycotts. I mean, and there is a political dimension, which is that the opposition parties are not united about whether they want to delay elections or not. And I'll get to that point here. But first, there is an irony, is that if you delay elections, you actually allow the military to stay longer in power, unless you actually can force the military to accept a civilian government. And it's not clear whether it's possible to get to a civilian government at this point. So postponing the elections may actually allow the military to stay in power for longer. There's another very concerning scenario here, and I would call it the Algeria scenario. In 1991, the elections were canceled, and the Islamists felt that they were robbed from a guaranteed win, and it escalated in civil war. I'm not saying that the conditions for a civil war here are met, but here you have a huge dilemma for the Muslim Brotherhood, which is undoubtedly the most organized and most powerful political force in Egypt. They want these elections as soon as possible because they know they would do very well. But the mood in Tahrir Square is against elections immediately. The mood in Tahrir Square is for a transitional civilian government today or tomorrow. It's to force the hand of the army. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood is in a very difficult position. It is hedging. It's denouncing the SCAF for its management of the transition and for the violence of the past few days. And even the Muslim Brotherhood suspects the SCAF for having engineered this escalation to delay the elections on purpose. I'm not sure I buy this theory. But the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't want the elections to be delayed, so they won't join the demonstrations starting today. They announced yesterday night and this morning they wouldn't join the others in Tahrir Square, which actually put the Muslim Brotherhood in, so we basically have three camps, right? You have the activists, you have the military, and you have the Muslim Brothers. And this is a very, this triangular game for me suggests that we're going to see a worsening in the crisis, not really an accommodation. The Muslim Brotherhood seems to be very aware of that, and they just announced just 2 hours ago that they would put forward a proposal for a new political transition. They don't want to be seen as either siding with the military or the activists. They want to see as brokers. Let me stop here for Egypt. I'm sure there will be tons of questions, and move to Syria. Well, I didn't make it to Syria at this time. It was too risky, but I got as close as it gets to Syria from the Lebanese border at several points on the border, including in Jabal Akoun and Wadi Khalid. So basically from there you see directly Syria. You see the Buhayrat Homs, the lake of Homs, and then Homs itself. And then on the good days, you actually see and hear the bombings. So, but basically, I met a lot of Syrian activists and defectors in Lebanon and Turkey over the past 2 weeks. And I also met pro-Assad loyalists as well. I think we've entered phase 3 in Syria. And phase 3 is going to be more violent and probably more decisive. Before I explain what phase 3 is, let me go back to phase 1 and 2. I think phase 1 was from the start of the uprising in March 15 to the spread of that uprising to the other cities. And these first 3 months basically were a win for the opposition, because the regime tried to contain the spread of the uprising and failed. It's as simple. It was a strategic win for the opposition. Phase 2 started with the uprisings in Homs and Hama and ended around Ramadan. That's when actually, and why do I end it at Ramadan? Because I was told by so many Syrian opposition leaders and others that Ramadan would be a key turning point, that it's at Ramadan that Homs and, Aleppo and Damascus would rise, that we would see the largest demonstrations ever, and they built that expectation with analysts like me, with a number of their interlocutors and so on. And the reality is that this didn't happen. I mean, there was a very brutal crackdown in Hama in August. And Hama, I won't say has been quiet, it hasn't been quiet, but basically the uprising was contained there. Phase 3 is, from that moment, the opposition realized that they have to change their tactics. And this is happening as we go, and I'm going to go through this. Now, first, I detected from the Assad supporters I talked to no willingness to compromise. This is an all-out confrontation. The concessions they're willing to offer are extremely cosmetic, but their narrative is really one of a violent uprising led by Salafis and criminal gangs and foreign conspirators against Syria. There is absolutely no recognition of the need for political reform. They all say it at this point. They're all behind is a security-first approach with minor concessions, very minor ones, and also a resort to what I would deem a last resort tactic by the regime, which is play the card of Syria as the beating heart of Arabism. And this is what we heard from Walid Maalem, from Bashar al-Assad in his Sunday Times interview a few days ago, from the Syrian ambassador to the Arab League and so on, that the reason why Syria is targeted is because it's the only country standing to Israel and the US in the region. The problem with that narrative is that since December or January of this year, tens of millions of Arabs have rewritten what Arabism is. And not a lot of people have respect for Bashar al-Assad anymore. I mean, he's been, trying to recover the Golan since, 1970 with his father. Well, hasn't happened. And in the name of that, he's created a lot of instability at his borders, but most importantly, a lot of repression at home. If you look at the latest Zogby poll, I was looking at this morning, Bashar al-Assad used to score around 9% of favorability opinion in the region. It's down at 0%. So I'm not sure how much he can use that card regionally or even domestically. Still, all this amounts to a quasi-civil war situation in Syria, and we shouldn't be afraid of that term. I know a lot of people just don't want to use it because they think that would give a negative connotation to the uprising. And let's be honest, most of the uprising, even up till now, is peaceful from all we see and all the reports we get. But you cannot not call it a quasi-civil war when cities are under siege, when you actually have evidence that a number of protesters and opposition activists are arming themselves, fighting back. We're talking about almost 4,000 deaths. There's evidence of sectarian killings and so on. I think we have to be honest and use that term. It doesn't mean that the responsibility is equally shared. It's not because I call it a civil war that I think that the Assad regime is less guilty than the opposition. I think it's more guilty by many degrees of magnitude. That said, I mean, not having been to Syria, it's difficult to assess the strengths of the pillars of the regime, the main pillars of the regime. We see defections in the military, but the main units remain cohesive. We've seen some defections in the Alawite communities, and I think perhaps the most interesting one was the Syrian actress Fadwa Sleiman. She's one of the great Syrian actresses, and she's Alawite. And 2 weeks ago, she shows up in the middle of a demonstration in Homs, takes the stage, and start attacking the regime, but also calling for solidarity among Syrians of all sects and so on. And that appearance has had an electrifying impact on the population because she's a very public figure. I'm pretty sure she's hiding. I mean, she is hiding right now. We know this for a fact. But we haven't seen senior figures, Alawi figures, breaking people who have a vested interest, who had a vested interest in the survival of this regime. When it comes to the business elites, we start seeing some hedging. I've talked to a number of businessmen who feel very uncomfortable, see that this regime, the Assad regime, is about to collapse, that they need to build bridges with the opposition and so on. These people still benefit from the relations with the regime, but I met a couple who basically fund, water and buy water and food and so on for the protesters. Send cooking gas and other things that they're starting to hedge. Then you have the other minorities, Christians, Jews, Ismaili, Shias, and so on. And here we start seeing defections. I met a lot of Christians who are now having second thoughts, a lot of Druze as well. But again, not leaders of the community. If you actually look at the Catholics and the Maronite bishops in Syria or the Orthodox bishops, they still come out in support of the regime. If you same with the Jews clerical leadership. And finally, the middle classes in Damascus and Aleppo. Those two groups are starting to move against the regime. They're risk averse. They're not tough, let's be honest. They're not the tough people of Hama and Homs. They cannot take the violence. They tend to privilege their comfort and access. But for them, basically, the economy has been so shaken, and I just talked to an IMF economist who told me that Syria's GDP is going to shrink by 5 to 8% this year, which is a huge number, much greater than what I expected. So those classes feel that the regime has been so shaken that it cannot provide for them anymore. It cannot provide security, and it cannot provide economic growth, so they're giving up on them. Another element here in this third phase is the consolidation of the opposition. The Syrian National Council has come together, 140 people, I think, a lot of very respected figures inside and outside the country, and they just published yesterday their platform. And they basically managed to undermine other opposition groups, especially the NCC, the National Coordinating Committee, which wanted dialogue with the regime. And right now, I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find a Syrian in the opposition who wants dialogue with the regime. People are behind the SNC, no longer behind the NCC. I think the NCC is composed of very respected and respectable figures, Michel Kilo, Haitham El-Mane, and so on. It's important that those two groups talk to each other and not start throwing insults at each other, which has happened and which would be very destructive for Syria's chances to evolve into a democracy later. But there is no doubt that the SNC has become the prime interlocutor of the international community, of Turkey, of the Arab League, and inside Syria, it's the group that enjoys the most support at this point. And finally, let me talk about the the debate over the foreign intervention and the possibility of a no-fly zone. And almost all the Syrians I met, and I know the Russian ambassador is here, so I just want to reinforce that message. Almost all the Syrians. Pardon?
I'm not ambassador in Syria.
No, I know. But I mean, with Russia having adopted that role, I mean, from an anecdotal perspective, almost all the Syrians I met are calling for a no-fly zone. Now, the problem for them is to define what a no-fly zone means and how to go about it and so on. But the first instinct that they have is to say, we need protection. We need civilian protection. Now, there is a problem in their argument because the Assad regime is not really using its air force to bomb them. I mean, we're not at that stage yet. So I buy the argument that, a no-fly zone for what? Here there is a military rationale, and this is what the defectors told me. Basically, the defectors are confident that there are many more soldiers willing to leave the ranks of the Assad military and join them. But they no longer want defectors to join them with small and light weaponry. They want them to join with their armored vehicles, with their tanks, with fixed assets. They want them to join with, to take over barracks and critical infrastructure points. They want to fight back. And they can only do so if they have a civilian, a no-fly zone. Because if they were to, seize a building, they would be very visible and very vulnerable. This is the military rationale for a no-fly zone. There is also, as I said earlier, there is a civilian protection rationale. And we're not there. I'm not saying that the regime is not killing its own citizens. It is, and in great numbers. But it's not using its air force to do so at the moment, or has done so in limited cases. So for me, you can't really build a strong argument for a no-fly zone today as things stand. But I'm not a Syrian, and I'm just conveying to you what I heard, which is a greater demand for a regional and international pressure and even intervention on the Assad regime. I spoke for much longer than I should have. I apologize, but thank you.
Thank you, Emile. Obviously, you had a lot to convey to us, and unfortunately, we don't have all afternoon. because it's all quite interesting. And I found the contrast between the three different situations to be as wide as one could possibly imagine, short of an actual civil war breaking out in Syria, which may or may not happen in the near term. What I'd like to do is turn to questions. For those of you who do have a question, please raise your hand. I'll try to recognize you. I may need some help from my colleague here, Elham, in keeping track of people. But once I select you, please use your microphone and identify yourself and ask a brief question so that we can spend most of our time listening to Emile. Any volunteers for a first question? Yes, please.
I can see the rationale for the Egyptian army trying to protect its privileges and acting as it is acting. I'm trying to understand how come the Aleppo and the Syrian middle classes and others, what has precluded them from sort of reacting and coming out? Is it literally two very different set of people? Is it sectarian type of thing? Or what has precluded them?
The middle classes are by nature averse to change, especially upper middle classes. They have a lot invested in the current situation. They trade. And they usually want their kids to be doctors and engineers. They don't really want them to go on the front lines. I mean, it's interesting even in Egypt when actually you meet with people, those who are fighting. I know a couple of middle class and upper middle class people who make it to the front line, but usually it's actually people from more disenfranchised people who fight that. So there is a natural reluctance to do this, but there's also other elements. I mean, Aleppo, for instance, has suffered a lot during the previous uprising in the 70s to 82. I mean, there were sectarian massacres there and so on, and they, the memory of that is still very, very powerful. In Damascus, if you look at how the Assad regime has built relationship with the business community, I mean, I count the Damascus business community as the strongest supporter of Assad at this point, the top businessmen, because they're the one who benefited the most from the economic liberalization of the country since 2000, 2001, the introduction of banks and so on. So. And finally, there's the Islamist Ba'bor, the scarecrow, that I mean, I met with a top Aleppo businessman who told me, you should be grateful to us. And I'm like, why is that? I'm like, we Syrians exposed the length of the beard of Erdogan. They are convinced that there is a region-wide Islamist project in the works, and that Turkey is behind. I mean, when I heard that quote, I wrote it down just because, really. I mean, but that's really the impression. Ultimately, I don't think these groups are unable to shift. I think they will shift eventually. Shrinking economy. Look at the reaction of you remember a few months ago when the Ministry of Economy and Trade stopped imports into Syria because they needed to protect the currency, and all the traders started screaming, and within a week they reversed this. Well, this is just one of the aspects. I've heard a lot more, from bankers in the region about bags of cash leaving the country altogether. People not paying their loans anymore. I mean, the economy is suffering at such a profound level that I just don't see how these people. Oh, by the way, also the fear of sanctions. I mean, I met a couple of businessmen who are engaged, who do business with the regime, and have no access to liquidities and to credit, letters of credit, who are worried that they're going to be cut out this altogether. I mean, Nabil Kuzbari has been named, and Nabil Kuzbari is one of the biggest businessmen in Syria. He had to shift his assets in the name of his kids and others and move everything. I mean, we're talking about a very senior person. And now he is, just to give you, he is in Brussels and in Europe, because he also holds Austrian citizenship, trying to lobby the EU not to add him to the list, because otherwise, he and many other Syrians who hold dual citizenship would be really affected. So no, I mean, I see those groups as able to shift over time. The question is whether they shift fast enough to prevent a full-fledged civil war or not.
Yes, please.
Emile, thank you very much. Talking about Egypt, what is the percentage, in your opinion, of the political active, I include the entire spectrum, from the liberals, anarchists, the Muslim Brotherhood, Salafis, and so on, who are actually politically active, who are actually taking an interest in what's happening in the country? Are they a majority or are they a minority? And if they are a majority or a minority, how big or small are they? And is there really a silent minority there, or a silent majority, that perhaps are disturbed by the events that are happening in Egypt right now? I mean, the chaos, what's happening in the country. And I'm getting a sense that perhaps we're only focusing on the square and not really focusing on Upper Egypt or other parts of Egypt where there is still a very traditional and probably pro-military faction.
Well, revolutions are always conducted and fought by minorities. And my sense is that most people, don't participate in them, whether they're risk averse because there is violence or because they have more immediate needs to attend to, and so on. So no, and honestly, I don't think that the Tahrir activists represent the majority of Egyptians. But I don't think the military itself also, has the support of a silent majority. And by the way, that's the term I don't like, silent majority and minority, but because you can't quantify it. It's silent. I mean, as soon as you say silent, you mean that there is no strong allegiance to anything, anyone. If you accept the polls today, the Muslim Brotherhood is supposed to do like 30-40%. Where do you count these people? So what you're suggesting is that the Tahrir activists don't represent the majority, I would agree with you. But I wouldn't oppose a Tahrir activist with a silent majority. Where you actually, I fully agree with you, is that these people can be swayed, and they can actually be prompted to be politically active. And we see this right now with the kind of media manipulation that's happening in Egypt. The SCAF has resorted to all the tactics Mubarak tried in January and February. These are foreign activists. They have agendas. Girls and boys sleep under the same tent. Therefore, this is all what we hear. This is what we heard also when the Maspero events took place. There's absolutely no doubt in Maspero that it's the army that is responsible for the killing of the Coptic demonstrators. But what was the military response? Oh, soldiers had been killed. Well, there was no evidence of that. It was a manipulation. There was no evidence. I mean, the state media talked a lot about this, but when it came to it, it was mostly fabrications. But the SCAF is fighting at that level. They want those people on their side. Now, the problem for the SCAF is that there are demonstrations in Suez right now, in Alexandria. It has spread throughout the country. It's not just in Tahrir Square it's happening. The second thing the second issue for the SCAF is that the silent majority doesn't look back at the Mubarak days and think, oh, how great it was back then. The problem is that the SCAF is not offering a vision for the next step. I mean, even if you don't like the activists, you don't know what the SCAF stands for. The SCAF stands for the SCAF. It stands for its own position and privileges and refuses civilian oversight. The SCAF, for instance, I mean, it was told to me very clearly, the SCAF doesn't want any transparency over defense procurement. Well, Egypt is in a dire economic situation. You know, if the SCAF wants to buy planes and boats and, you know, and ships and things, is it really the priority? I mean, should they be liable, I mean, accountable to civilian oversight? When you put it this way to Egyptians, I mean, civilians, their view shifts. The difference is that it's really a media battle right now that's happening. But again, I mean, on your fundamental premise, do the activists represent the majority? No. But they didn't represent the majority in January or February. I don't think that the Tunisian revolutionaries, those who count are those who show up, basically. And if you say I'm silent majority, well, you're silent until you start talking and you start you know, entering politics in a more active way. We can't assume where your views are.
Yes, please.
I have a question about the likely economic programs that could emerge from the transition, because you mentioned that the programs that have been tried so far in terms of liberalization, privatization, are seen as benefiting the entrenched elites. And that in Tunisia, you mentioned that there is a populist wave in favor of more state involvement, greater subsidies. I just wonder how that's going to play out, particularly given that unless these economies can generate growth and jobs, these revolutions will fail.
I'm not an economist, but so I'll talk to this point from a political economy perspective. When you look at what happened in the Arab world in the past 9 months, 11 months now, what you basically see is a demand for a more active, a more statist economy, a more active role for the state in the economy. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily going to be the case, but listen out there. People want more subsidies. They want more job and immediate jobs. Who can create immediately jobs? It's not the private sector, it's the public sector. You know, more hiring in the security forces, in the bureaucracy. I mean, this is where the demand is. It would put enormous fiscal pressure on governments that don't have that money and, you know, still need to get credit abroad and need to, you know, ask the IMF and others to intervene, and they will only do it under certain conditions. So this, for me, is going to be a key tension and a key aspect of those transitions. Now, if you look across the region, it's the Islamist movements that tend to have the most neoliberal economic policies. I mean, this is, I talked about how An-Nahda accepted that paradigm. The Muslim Brotherhood is not that different, actually. You know, if I were a big businessman or if I were a foreign banker, I would go for these guys. The problem at the same time is that if they're Islamists and they start putting constraints on tourism, for instance, you can't drink or you can't sunbath in your swimsuit, to put it you know, in simple terms, then you risk hurting a very important aspect of your economy. I think 1 in 8 jobs in Egypt depends on the economy. In Tunisia, it's also in the same order. You're talking about huge. So, you know, the Islamists have to not just show their neoliberal or their liberal credentials. They also have to explain, you know, how they're going to manage the tourism industry. What matters in the short to medium term, to be honest, is people are not thinking in terms of macro policies, macroeconomic policies right now. And you can only have a serious substantive debate about those issues once there is political stability. And this is where, right now, it's a very fair question when it comes to Tunisia. When it comes to Egypt, I mean, I don't think anyone fighting on the street in Tahrir or elsewhere today is paying much attention to that. But actually, to your point, I had an interesting discussion with an Egyptian economist, and actually also Egyptian activists and politicians who are basically saying, how does this interim government what legitimacy has this interim government has to accept loans from the IMF or others? It's only an interim government. I heard the same thing in Tunisia, for instance. People are like, they don't want to contract more debt while they're in a transitional phase, because they don't, first, because of the debt and the burden of the debt, second, because of the possible conditionalities. And this factored into Egypt's decision to turn down the IMF loan, 6 months ago. They turned down a loan with, very preferential rates and very easy conditions compared to typical IMF loans, which I think was a mistake at an economic level. They needed that cash because they didn't want conditionality and thought that, well, the Gulf states would provide that facility, that liquidity. And actually the Gulf states, well, typically didn't deliver.
Yes, please.
And
Yeah, we'll go here and then to the ambassador.
If he has a question, he can first.
Sure, okay. Ambassador
My
Smina?
question is very short.
Mhm.
I mean, I'm not a man of big perspective, so to say. 10 years maybe
Mhm.
ahead of my career. Can you tell me, after you have seen there and we have read and we have known about everything what is going on in the Arab world, are we still in the beginning of the Arab Spring, or do we have any chance? You mean overall global vision? Do we have any chance for stability?
Well, too soon to tell, but the way I frame it is I'll frame it in different ways. The first one is that if someone can convince me that the pre-December 2010 trajectory in those various states would have led to better outcomes, please do so anytime. So, the notion that the current difficulties, and they're momentous, and I agree, somehow make the gains in terms of political culture and openness and so on that have happened in the past 9 months nil, then that's I personally don't accept that view. I think it's very important in terms of Arab ownership of their own politics, of their own governance, of their own aspirations, grievances, that we recognize. That we recognize what the progresses of the past 11 months. But it's a very fair question to ask whether it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I'm going to be honest. In Syria, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. But I don't see how it would have gotten better at all under the current regime of Assad that is fighting for its survival. In Egypt, well, Egypt adopted economic liberalization and reforms and so on, but it was skewed. It benefited a very few. I mean, there was no guarantee from the decade of economic liberalization in the 90s, that started in the 90s up until, that actually economic liberalization leads to political reform. In fact, we saw a consolidation of power at the top during that period. Syria is going to get worse. Egypt is also going to get worse. That's in the short to medium term. On the long term, they will get better. As people need to own their politics. People need to own their politics. And this is the real achievement of the Arab awakening. It's not, I mean, can someone tell me, aside from the '89 spring in Eastern Europe, can someone point to me to a linear transition anywhere in the world? Now, in a way, what happened in '89 and 1990 was an accident of history. You had the collapse of an ideology. Nothing happened. There was no competitor for what was offered on the other side. The Eastern and Central European countries had two support systems. In foreign and defense policy, they wanted to join NATO. On economic reform and regional integration, they wanted to join the EU. They put themselves on those tracks, they got all the financial and technical assistance they wanted, and they got to that goal. In the Arab world, you don't have that. It's going to be a much more complicated transitional process. Egypt cannot count on Tunisia for help. Syria cannot count on Algeria for help. Each country is on its own. You know, the support is actually coming from abroad when it exists. I don't think that when the Gulf states, I don't think that the Gulf state support, for instance, is necessarily a good thing in all cases in Egypt or Tunisia or Syria and so on. It's a much more complicated picture. I expect a lot of blood in coming months. I mean, I would be disingenuous to say otherwise. Is it worth it? Yes. This is what transitions to democracies often, you know, require those kind of sacrifices.
Thank you, and I apologize for coming late, but I hope that I didn't miss some points. Maybe I will ask, or I will just comment about it, because first of all, I am from Egyptian embassy, and I'm not gonna defend the Egyptian regime or something. Even today, even my colleagues, they have already denied all the violence that is going on the last 3 days. But I have just 3 points. First of all, about the SCAF and its relation with most of the political parties or the main political actors in Egypt let's talk about till 19th of November. Before 19th of November, 3 days ago. Excuse me, I didn't feel that you have already given the impression that is your image about most of these political actors, that all of them in bad relation with the SCAF, which is not totally true. For example, the Islamists, most of them, they are in good relations, they were in good contacts with the SCAF. Even the 17 political parties that they were already working during Mubarak regime, they were already in contact with them. Even most of the activists already, they were already in contact and didn't have that much problem till this day, which was the main crisis or the main problem, this supranational
the Silmi document, exactly.
Yeah,
and things fundamentally changed that day.
Yeah, but it was not that big difference between most of them with the SCAF. Okay, okay. Let me give me the example of the at least the relation of the SCAF. Let's focus on the relation of the SCAF and the remnants of the old regime of Mubarak. Yeah. Okay, he didn't get that high attention for the request from most of the political actors, that is, they want to make a law against those people. And he has already finally made it just yesterday, just to calm down most of the people in Egypt. But it doesn't mean also that he was supporting them. Even and that's why at least that is they make a judge, or they went to they get a verdict from the courts against those people. So it was. This is the question that you were trying to ask about, if they are incompetent or if they are evil. Most of the political parties themselves, beside the silent majority, that's sure, they were already favoring the SCAF steps, and they were just giving them some excuse. Okay, they don't have that experience, they don't have that political experience, and they are not that much incompetent. Till 18th of November. I'm just telling you about this scene till that day. And let me give you the example. Okay, the memorandum that they have already made, it was raised for survey on 19th of March. Okay, they have already misunderstood, and they have already changed it, and they have already made another one, bigger, broader one. But the main roadmap of the SCAF, 78% of the ones that they went to vote, they said yes. 78, which is very high majority, and it was shock for Baradei, for Amr Moussa, for all the main nominants, that they were saying no, we are against this. So 78% they went to say yes. Why? Not only just because they are favoring this political as an ideal roadmap, but they are favoring anything the SCAF will say, because most of them, the middle class or most of the majority, they are in favor of the security. They are more confident for anything the SCAF will, or any decision the SCAF will take. So this is just the relation that I'm trying just to, it was till 18th of November, it was not that dark. There was some support. There was already contacts between most of the political parties with the SCAF, especially the Islamists and especially Muslim Brotherhood, there was in high good relations. And the roadmap, it was not that excluded because has already high publicity, high support from most of these political parties. That's what I'm trying to raise or I'm trying to explain. And the last point, okay, I know to compare between January and November, now we are in a big mess. And because of the violence that have already started in the last 2 days, even nobody now can support the SCAF. This is the main, I think this is a turning point in the last 2 days, which is not till now clear, and we cannot looking forward for what's going or what's going tomorrow or what's the solution. It's really a big crisis. But what is my conclusion, again, that is the middle class or the most of the people that is they were asking about, till now, even after what happened, some of them is still favoring or still supporting the SCAF, at least to keep or to give them the security, which is the main priority for them. That's all.
Okay, we're running short on time, and before I want to give you plenty of time to address his comments. But are there any other questions that we can couple in now, so that yes, and then anyone else? Okay, where? Oh, okay, so over there and then there. If you can make them very quick, and then we can allow Emile to address the comments and your questions, and then we can wrap up.
Okay, two brief questions basically on Syria. Do you think that Assad will leave power by his own will sometime, whether sooner or later, or it would be until the army turns against him? This is one. And second, will there be another Libya-like scenario in Syria? And from what we've been hearing and the comments that Assad and Muallim are saying, that anything should happen in Syria will have repercussions on the whole area. Is that how do you explain that, or what are your comments on that? Thanks.
Okay, in the corner.
My question pertains to Egypt in particular. Basically, do you see a pressure valve, if you will, to the current round of unrest, where the resignation of Mubarak sufficed earlier in the year?
Okay. Your points about Egypt are well taken. I think there was actually a lot of goodwill for the SCAF early on. The only problem I have is that I don't see a roadmap. I mean, I agree with you. The referendum on March 19 was a success for the SCAF, except that the SCAF actually modified the constitutional principles later, and that already started eroding the confidence of people in its ability to do it. The second issue is that the SCAF didn't announce quickly enough dates for national elections and presidential elections, and the SCAF really hesitated between a constitution-first approach or an elections-first approach, whether to have the presidential elections first or the legislative elections first. I mean, there was a lot of unclarity on that, and I personally, on the evil to incompetent scale, I would put the SCAF closer to the incompetent one, because it's very difficult to manage such a transition. And I think that goodwill, which was pretty high at a point, and there is absolutely no doubt that back in February, the army was riding very high. I was there in February, I was there later in the year and so on, but you sense that the level of support was declining because there was no clear vision for the transition. And then the timetable kept on extending until we heard early 2013. And I mean, I'm not Egyptian myself, but my Egyptian friends, who a number of them were supportive or wanted to give the benefit of the doubt to the SCAF, they jumped from their seats. 2013 is 2 years of military rule, during which the army wouldn't have accepted to rule except by decree. I mean, people were not at all comfortable with this. And another point, I think you say November 19th was a turning point. It was a turning point for, I think, probably most Egyptians. But the real turning point for the political forces, I would date it to the day the SCAF and the Deputy Prime Minister Slimi briefed the political parties on the supra-constitutional principles. I think for me that was the real turning point. I was in Cairo that day, and I talked to people from Wafd, Tajammu. I mean, we can list all these parties, and including some that are that were pro-military at the point. And this is when the attitude shifted fundamentally. And the problem is that the SCAF didn't react quickly enough after the rejection of that document to address the concerns of those parties. And finally, on the Falouls, the remnants of the NDP, there was the ruling in Mansoura, right, that prevented some, and it's actually the SCAF could have used that ruling, just a judiciary, a decision by the judiciary to make to impose a ban on any former NDP leader running. But they didn't. They only made the concession yesterday, as you said. And yesterday, during the violence, and people during violence don't absorb and don't accept things the same way. So, don't get me wrong. Yes, the SCAF support level started there. And now it's much lower. I mean, and you said it yourself. And that's the tragedy. I think there was an opening for a much smoother transition. I think the SCAF got paranoid at some level, a real sense of insecurity. Let me actually get to your questions on Egypt. I don't think the demonstrators today would settle for anything less than the SCAF's departure, and I'm not convinced that the SCAF departure is in order. Yesterday there was the whole drama over the cabinet resigning or not resigning, and the resignation being accepted or not. But even that, I don't think would have satisfied the demonstrators, because they feel that they made the compromise back in January and February when they allowed the SCAF to come to power. They didn't push all the way and so on, and they're not going to make that mistake again. My point to them is that that's a very extreme approach. I mean, ultimately, they have to find a compromise with the SCAF, because as our Egyptian friend here mentioned, most people want order, they want security. And the political parties cannot deliver those two. The MOI and the Central Security Forces are already hated by the population, and you want to push the army out, so who's left to impose order and security? You need to actually talk to the SCAF. And that's a fundamental point. And finally, on the issue of Syria, I don't know how Bashar al-Assad can leave by will. I mean, this is not a man. This is a family. This is a system. And even if he wanted to, I mean, I think the web of loyalties and interest is too dense to allow him to say, that mess, I'm off. I'm gonna transition to someone else. I think you will have other people who are probably even more willing to use force who could replace him. There are ideas floating, right, that Gulf states or other countries could offer Assad asylum, and that would be the end of it. I think the top echelon in Syria, perhaps the support base of the Assad regime is not very broad, but it's pretty deep. There are people who have a vested interest in his survival and survival of his family at the top of the ladder. So it's not going to be by will, sadly so. A Libya-like scenario, well, that would be a tragedy, to be honest. Libya's neighbors didn't jump into Libya to fight that war. There was no interest in breaking up Libya. There was no interest in the Libya war was contained. Let's be honest. Yes, Gaddafi employed foreign mercenaries and so on. It was contained on the ground. In the case of Syria, I mean, Syria has borders with very important countries that don't see eye to eye, that are regional rivals. Libya, I mean, the opposition in Syria is unable to seize a piece of land and with a big city in the middle and say, this is going to be our territory, this is going to be our capital, and we'll expand from it. I think it would be a mistake for the Syrian opposition to embrace, to just fight a civil war, saying that they can win it. I think eventually they will win it, but it's going to be bloody, and it won't guarantee a transition to a more participatory system. My concern about the civil war is actually the day after, is that the day after things may actually be a lot worse. Whereas if they stick to peaceful demonstrations and if we stick to diplomatic pressure from the outside and so on, the chances of a better transition the day after are higher.
Well, thank you, Emile. That was quite far-reaching and insightful. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I think Emile will be here for a few more minutes, and you might be able to corner him unless he asks for protection.
Nah. No, I see.
But you can follow Emile. He is a very active tweeter. For those of you who live in that universe, I'm not, but it doesn't mean you can't. You can follow him at Emile _Hokayem or at IISS_org. Both those sites you can find some of his words of wisdom. And let's see, next week he'll also be down in Doha for the BBC Doha debates. So you can tune in and watch him there, along with some of his colleagues. It should be quite an event. I'm hoping to find some time to do that. Our next session will be on the 20th of December. It'll be part of the IISS Geoeconomic and Strategy Program. We'll have Charles Robertson, Global Chief Economist with Renaissance Capital, and he will be discussing the financial crisis in Europe, the political costs, and the effects on some of the emerging markets. And then two last and quick things. Please remember that we at the Institute are a nonprofit organization, and we draw our funds from our international membership. So if you are interested, I believe we have some applications on the side table there. I would encourage you to at least look into it. And finally, as always, I'd like to thank those that helped set and organize all this, including Praveen, which I think he's hiding in the back room, Wendy and Jen, who dutifully handle the refreshments and keep this place clean and running orderly, and of course, Eleanor Pitt here, who's our chief organizer for these types of events. So I think we'll end with thanking them and Emile.